On Saturday the 6th of February this year, 4.5-month-old Jennifer Gill fell seriously ill at her home in Stockport. Jennifer had been unable to keep down food or drink for 24 hours, and the medicine prescribed by a local GP had brought no improvement. At midnight, Jennifer began to fight for breath. Her eyes rolled in her head. She became unresponsive. Mrs. Karen Gill set off with a family friend for her mother's house where there was a telephone. Her local health centre never answers the telephone at night, so Mrs. Gill called a neighbouring health centre. The doctors there were not making their own night calls. A message was left for the deputising service. Mrs. Gill and her parents noted the time as 1:20. At 10 to 3, an hour and a half later, the Gills were becoming alarmed. No deputy doctor had arrived. They left by car for the local infirmary, but it was too late. Jennifer Gill died in her mother's arms on the journey.
If he would have got here even half an hour, we could have rushed her to hospital, he could have told us and we could have got her there, and he could have got, you know, just sort of done something for her. It was just terrible to see her dying and whimpering. It's terrible.
Tonight, World in Action looks at how an increasing number of family doctors are reluctant to leave their homes at night and weekends, and at how deputising services, run for profit and often without proper outside supervision, are taking on an ever larger part of the GP's duties.
The surgery is now closed if your call is a serious medical emergency.
The whole public concern about deputising services surely has to indicate that something is wrong. By far the majority of general practitioners in Britain fulfil their contract for providing emergency services. A minority do not. They let the side down. And indeed, some would argue, have caused unnecessary harm to general practice as a whole.
The tragic case of Jennifer Gill is not isolated. Tonight we tell the stories of 4 of a number of complaints we've investigated. 4 out of many thousands dealt with quite successfully by deputising services every year. Each one raises basic questions about the use of deputising services. Questions of concern to many doctors and representatives of patients.
Theoretically, the general practitioner is responsible for his patients 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. He has nominal responsibility. And the idea of a deputising service was originally a good one. It gave the GP the odd weekend off, the odd night off. But increasingly, in some areas, doctors are running a sort of lock-up shop, you know, working banker's hours, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and switching over to the deputising service for the rest of the time, so that they're opting out of their real responsibility.
Round-the-clock care is a big responsibility for GPs, but so are the rewards. They earn an average of £29,500 a year, including nearly £4,000 for unsocial hours. Traditionally, GPs have done some of their own night duty and shared the rest with close colleagues. Many still do.
I think the main advantage is that we know the other general practitioners who take part in our rota. They all practice under the same roof, and so we know them and we trust them to look after our patients.
How great a burden is it for you?
I don't think it's a very great burden at all. Our rota consists of being on 1 weeknight and 1 weekend in approximately 5. And during that time, I would expect to have to get out of bed approximately once every 3 weeks.
Those GPs unable or unwilling to be in a rota hand over to the deputising service. There are more than 50 such services operating throughout Britain. Family doctors hand over thousands of patients to deputising, and only rarely is there consultation about ongoing treatment. Case 1 is that of 49-year-old Sean Phelan, who on the 16th of May felt a pain and tightness in his chest and had difficulty breathing. Mr. Phelan had suffered previous heart problems and his wife called her GP.
I told him that he had pains in his chest and his arms, and he said tell him to take a heart tablet, but he'd already taken one, which I told the doctor, so he said, well, tell him to take another one, and if he's no better to ring me back.
The doctor was later to say he told Mrs. Phelan to ring back within 15 minutes, but Mr. Phelan felt worse, and when his wife rang back 21 minutes later, the doctor had gone off duty. The call was diverted to the deputising service, which sent a doctor immediately. He examined Mr. Phelan, left 2 Valium tablets and advised him to call his GP in the morning.
I did tell him that my husband, had had the pains. He'd already had 2 tablets, which had had no effect. And that, he'd had 2 previous heart attacks.
In the early hours of the morning, Sean Phelan collapsed at his wife's feet as she called for an ambulance. He died of a heart attack on the way to hospital. What do you feel about the fact that your own doctor didn't come out when you telephoned him?
Well, he knew my husband's history, and he'd been ill for quite a long time. The doctor had already told me that he would never work again. So he was well aware that he was a sick man. And, I was very upset that he wasn't there when he told me to call the second time.
Mr. Phelan's GP was Dr. Sarma from Chorlton in Manchester. His inquest statement said he suspected Mr. Phelan's problem was angina. Dr. Sarma declined to answer our questions about the case. There is no formal procedure for discussing patients when they're handed over to a deputising service. The Royal College of General Practitioners believes that the handover procedure in the traditional rota system is the correct one.
I mean, it is really important to be able to talk to your partner beforehand. People will often say, by the way, Mrs. So-and-so, you may expect a call from her this evening. She has got so-and-so. And at the other end, in the handover, personal face-to-face contact where you can actually sit down as 2 colleagues and discuss the management of the case. I think that's very important.
Many night visits turn out to be routine, but questionable procedures for responding to the genuine emergency were at the heart of Case 2, that of Jennifer Gill. 4.5-month-old Jennifer died from inhalation of vomit after waiting 1.5 hours for a deputy doctor to arrive. At the inquest, the coroner, Peter Revington, referred to the appalling delay and told Mr. and Mrs. Gill they deserved an explanation. They got one. Earlier this month, Stockport Family Practitioner Committee held a hearing into their complaint. The Gills were told that the deputy had gone to 3 other calls first, arriving at the Gills' house 15 minutes after the child had died. The deputising service concerned was Medical Emergency Doctor Service, or MEDS, in Manchester. This service has answered over 1 million calls in 25 years and is proud of its record. Deputy doctors out in their cars decide on which calls should receive priority from information passed by the telephonist. Does a child with difficulty breathing constitute an urgent case in the service?
Yes, it does.
Why then, in the case of Jennifer Gill, did it take something like 1.5 hours for a deputy to arrive at the house?
Well, one reason for this is that when the deputy had already spent some time on another call, that one of the calls which he got was a call to a patient with chest pain, which can be an acute emergency, which is a life-threatening emergency, and he decided to go to this one.
But he went to 3 cases.
Well, indeed he did, yes. Well, the doctor, as it happened, was very busy on that night, and this is one of the reasons why we're looking very closely at this, because I don't think that the doctor on duty taking the decision is necessarily 100% the best solution.
211.
Other deputising services have different systems for assessing the urgent case. At Duty Doctors, a few miles away in Salford, telephone operators without formal medical training decide on priority from symptoms they're given. This is one of the points taken up by Conservative MP Christopher Hawkins, who's campaigning for a major reform of deputising arrangements.
If you have a group practice where the doctors cover for each other at night, then when you phone in, at least you talk to a GP who says, frequently asks you questions about symptoms. Do you have this? Do you have that? And from that, he can tell whether it's a serious case. The patient doesn't know, and in my opinion, patients should not be involved in self-diagnosis. And clearly, a telephone operator at a deputy service should not be expected to diagnose priorities. I would like to see a general practitioner available at every deputising service to ask the right questions and to decide priorities.
Even when a deputy doctor arrives, he'll seldom have met the patient before and is unlikely to know anything about him. In cases where the medical records are important, this can be a problem. Case 3 involves Tony Mogan.
He'd get up and he'd sing, all the pub would be clapping and everything. But he was a very, very lovely person, a lovable person.
Tony Mogan died on the 16th of July from meningitis and septicemia. He was 28 and the father of 4 young children.
I mean, my life now is going to the cemetery every other day because I don't feel any happiness until I'm there. Maybe one day I might feel stronger, but right now I feel I need my husband and my children need their father. And it's a thing we can never have. Why? The question why to me is a big thing in my life, a very big question in my life. Why? But
it was on the 14th of July that Tony Mogan fell ill with headache and stiff limbs and was unable to leave his home. He sent his brother Chris to telephone for a home visit from his GP, but Chris was told by the receptionist the symptoms were too vague to justify a doctor calling. A few hours later, Tony's sister heard that he was unwell and called at his flat. She could get no reply from the flat and was about to give up.
Well, I'd knocked a few times, and then that's when I heard him calling me, you know. I was looking through the letterbox. He sort of had his arm against the wall, holding himself as he was walking down the hall. He had with these horrible marks on his leg and coming up his body. They were like, well, the only way I could explain them, they were like blackberries or something, you know, breaking out all over him.
Angela was alarmed because Tony had twice before been seriously ill with meningitis. By this time, the surgery was closed and a caretaker passed on her call to the deputising service.
When the doctor did come, I took him in to Tony. I went in the living room. The next minute, the doctor was back out, going towards the front door. So I said, "Excuse me, doctor, can you tell me what's wrong with Tony?" So he turned around and went, "Oh, he's got a tummy bug, gastroenteritis. Be sure to hand the letter in to his own doctor at the surgery tomorrow morning." And I've left him a prescription.
Early next morning, Tony Mogan's family found him foaming at the mouth and losing consciousness. He was taken to hospital where he died the next day. The doctor had come from the Liverpool Locums deputising service, but no representative was prepared to discuss the case or the importance of medical records being available to deputies. The Mogan family doctor is Patrick Gibson, who accepts that the symptoms the family described would suggest meningitis.
Yes, indeed, when you present symptoms like that, it certainly would. It certainly should be included in a differential diagnosis.
But Dr. Gibson doesn't accept that knowledge of Tony Mogan's medical history would have assisted himself or a deputising doctor to make a correct diagnosis.
No, on the contrary, as I said before, I suspect that, in fact, it would have been the very opposite, where familiarity with the records, with the case, could have bred contempt, and that the last thing I might have thought of would be that diagnosis, simply because he'd had the thing before, and it is extraordinarily rare for someone to get this type of infection twice.
This despite the fact that the symptoms might ordinarily lead you to suspect meningitis.
Quite, yeah.
well, I think his own doctor should have come out personally. And if his own doctor couldn't come out himself, I think his locum doctor should have had Tony's files or something about the history of his illness. There should have been some record of Tony's illness if he decided to send a stranger to my husband.
Many GPs see the special relationship they and their partners build with patients as a valuable part of their caring service. Case 4 shows how, when that continuity is interrupted, the results can be distressing. Though Mrs. Mary Hayes was 92, she'd enjoyed far better health than her 65-year-old daughter Alice, but last New Year's Day she was taken ill.
Her head fell forward onto her chest, and it took me quite a while to rouse her from that. But I put her into a wheelchair, and I was going to wheel her across the room to her bed, but I couldn't get her out of the chair again.
Although Miss Hayes herself is a cancer patient who's undergone radical surgery, she'd looked after her mother at home for more than 3 years. While the old lady could help herself, they could manage. But when she became ill, the situation quickly became critical. During that weekend, 3 deputy doctors visited Mrs. Hayes as her condition deteriorated, but none was prepared to get her into hospital. By the end of the second day, Miss Hayes and her cousin were desperate. A 4th deputy was called.
He walked in and he says, "What do you expect me to do?" He says, "You've already had 3 doctors before." So I said, "Yes, but I'd like you to look at my mother and find out what's wrong with her, that she's very ill, and that I'm sure she'd be much better off in hospital because we couldn't lift her." So he went over to the bed and he had a look at her, and he turned round to us and he says, "There's nothing wrong with her." So I think my cousin said to him, "If you don't get her into hospital this time," she says, "I'm going to ring 999 myself and see how we can go on."
The deputy agreed to get Mrs. Hayes into hospital in Leeds, where 56 hours later she died. Leeds Emergency Doctors Limited, which sent the deputies, is unwilling to discuss the case because a family practitioner committee hearing is pending. The service disputes details of Miss Hayes' account, but accepts that she underwent a distressing experience. What were your problems in terms of trying to move her around, and I mean, she couldn't get up from the bed?
Possibly. You see, I mean, to say anything that she wanted to do, she had to do in the bed. I couldn't move her to get her out. I mean, you'd think the doctors would have known that. That's what I was meaning when I said I couldn't move her, not even to turn her.
It must have been a terrible 2 days for you.
Oh, it was just dreadful. I shall never forget it as long as I live. It's just like a nightmare that you couldn't get out of.
The Royal College of General Practitioners believes that however good the deputy doctor's service, nothing can substitute for the family doctor or his close colleague.
And one can think of households where there is interdependence of one person on another, which suddenly can become disturbed. Now, in these sort of situations, a knowledge of local social services, of the rest of the family, who can provide immediate backup to manage a hot situation, that's what family doctoring is all about. And no emergency doctor can have that sort of knowledge that comes from the network, as it were, of people within which he lives. It's an essential part of our service.
The GP receives an average of £2,500 a year for working unsocial hours, and payments for individual late-night calls add about £1,500, making a total of £4,000 a year. An average Midlands doctor using deputising for most out-of-hours calls will pay £2,650. So a GP who farms out most night calls remains £1,350 in pocket. The deputising service has to pay for telephones, premises, often drivers and cars, and for deputies, but it's still big business. Latest figures published by Emergency Doctors of Leeds and subsidiaries show an annual turnover of more than £1 million, with the highest paid director earning £52,000. Deputies in some services around the country earn as little as £25 for a night shift, with an extra payment of a few pounds for individual calls.
This, in fact, is an incentive to the doctor to start early, to carry on perhaps after that he should have gone off, and it gives a little incentive, a little interest during the course of what can be very tedious and difficult.
But he shouldn't have a financial interest in doing as many calls as possible, surely.
There is no difference in the end in what the doctor gets. The difference is purely a psychological one.
Well, there must be some difference in what he earns. The more calls he does, the more money he will make.
That is true, but it would be possible to recast that same money in a way which would remove that altogether. And the effect would be a diminution in the efficiency of the service, and this is the whole thing, that we're always trying to upgrade, not to impede or inhibit in any way.
But wouldn't the effect be that doctors spend longer with patients?
No, this is something we monitor in other ways.
Well, of course there are risks in medical care if you pay people on piecework rates. If you put them on the equivalent of a factory production line, then quality is bound to suffer. If they're dashing from one patient to another as quickly as they can in order to earn a reasonable living, then I think it is unlikely that we shall get the same quality of care.
The Department of Health has delegated the job of supervising deputising services to local family practitioner committees. The FPC in turn delegates day-to-day scrutiny of the service to a professional advisory committee. At each level of supervision, the medical profession has substantial presence. The FPC, for example, has 30 members. 15 of them will be GPs, pharmacists and other professionals. Another 11 are appointed by the Area Health Authority. Only 4 are nominated by local councils. The Professional Advisory Committee consists only of doctors. Most will be using deputising services themselves.
They have a vested interest. I mean, for a doctor, deputising services offer leisure, nights off, weekends off. The more you use it, the more leisure you get. They also offer many doctors income. Some doctors are involved in part owning or owning the deputising service or working for them. Now, in my view, there is no reason why these people should want to tell the truth about the use of deputising services. So I want an independent system which is basically based on the public, because the public want to make sure they get good doctors, and in my opinion, they should monitor the use of deputising services.
Earlier this year, Christopher Hawkins drew the attention of the Health Minister to a number of complaints involving deputising services. The Minister, Kenneth Clarke, asked FPCs to reassure him that Department of Health guidelines were being followed and that GPs weren't using deputising services excessively. The DHSS instruction is that consent should not be given to any standing arrangement under which a deputising service would care for the practitioner's patients every night and weekend.
The trick that happens is one doctor can use the deputy service 3 nights a week, and the other doctor in the practice can use it for 4 nights of the week. And between them, that means they've had every night covered by deputising services. And the public then, at no point will they ever get their own doctor, or will he be available. They're just splitting the week up between them. So they each might meet the code of practice individually, but they're never on call at night.
You regard this as a camouflage of the truth?
Yes.
That conclusion was borne out by World in Action's own survey of the use being made of deputising services. We selected 100 surgeries with some 300 doctors from towns and cities throughout Britain and telephoned each one every night for a week. We found that 53 had engaged deputising services every night of the week. Another 9 used the service 6 nights out of 7, and a further 5 used it on 5 nights. Even more worrying, our survey found that 7 surgeries failed to answer the telephone at all on any night of the week. That left only 26 out of 100 surgeries doing their own calls in a rota or cooperative system for more than 4 nights in the week. Dr. Brown, you're the chairman of the Joint Professional Advisory Committee in Greater Manchester and a member of the Family Practitioner Committee in Salford. Why don't you enforce the Department of Health guidelines on the amount of use that GPs make of the deputising service?
The Department of Health guidelines?
Yes, on the amount of use that GPs may make of the deputising service.
What the guidelines are there by the Department of Health?
Well, the guidelines are quite specifically that GPs are not allowed to use the service every night and every weekend.
Where does it give that?
In the 1966 guidelines from the Department of Health and Social Security.
I'm sorry, I've not seen that. You did not give me notice that this question was going to be asked either.
Well, as the chairman of the Professional Advisory Committee that has the responsibility for monitoring the deputising service, I mean, doesn't it seem surprising that you don't know about those guidelines?
Well, if they exist, yes.
So there's no restriction on the amount of use that general practitioners can make of the deputising service?
There is, as far as I know, there are no guidelines. We've not received any guidelines from the Department of Health. My committee have not been, and neither have the FPCs.
So without any knowledge of those guidelines, there is no restriction on the amount of use that GPs can make of deputising service?
What guidelines are you talking about?
Well, the ones I refer to are the Department of Health and Social Security.
Yes, would you like to show me?
Well, the specific guideline to professional advisory committees is that one, which I've marked there,
Yes.
which says she'll make sure that there's not excessive use as outlined in the 1966 guideline. And the 1966 guideline says what I've indicated there, consent shall not be given for use every night and every weekend.
Yes, that's right. Well, we don't give consent, or we don't give it. The FPCs give it, of course, and they give it on our recommendation. Certainly, they, as you say here, consent should not be given to any standing arrangement under which a deputising service would care for the practitioner's patients every night and every weekend.
Is that guideline new to you?
No standing arrangement has ever. That guideline is new, yes.
Well, there's no, you don't impose any restriction, and a number of doctors in the Greater Manchester area do use it every night and every weekend, do they not?
I don't know.
Do you not think it's the PAC's responsibility to know that?
I don't. Where does it say it's the PAC's responsibility?
In the guideline that I've given you here,
yes,
which says the PAC shall ensure that GPs don't make excessive use.
It depends what you call excessive now, doesn't it?
Well, excessive is as outlined in the 1966 guideline that I've handed to you.
Every night and every weekend?
Yes. By now, the Health Minister will be analysing the reassurances he's had from Dr. Brown and his colleagues from all around the country. He'll then decide whether to order a major reform of the rules on deputising.